Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to tackle a topic that we know is important to many of you, childhood apraxia of speech, or CAS.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex one, but one that's so important to understand, especially for parents who are just starting out on this journey.
We've got a ton of great resources to dig into for this deep dive. The Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists has some fantastic materials, and we've also got research papers and even some really powerful real-life case studies.
We really want to give our listeners some solid advice and tips they can actually use.
So before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics. With CAS,
Right to the point. It's a question we hear a lot, and it can be a bit tricky to explain.
I know I was reading through one of our sources, and it described CAS as a neural inefficiency of sensorimotor processing.
Ooh, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a bit jargony. Can you break that down for us in plain English?
Well, think of it this way. For any of us to talk, our brains have to plan out all the movements our mouths need to make.
Okay, that makes sense.
And with CAS, there's a kind of disconnect between the brain's plan and the actual movements. So the child knows what they want to say, but they struggle to get their mouth to cooperate.
So the message is there, but the delivery is getting scrambled.
That's a great way to put it. It's like the brain is sending out a signal, but it's getting lost in translation somewhere along the way.
Got it. So just to be crystal clear, this isn't about a child's intelligence or understanding.
No, absolutely not. And that's a huge point, I think, for parents to remember. Kids with CAS are just as smart and capable as their peers.
It's just that their speech system isn't quite keeping up with their brain power.
Exactly. Which is why it's so important to address CAS as a speech motor disorder. It's about helping the child's mouth catch up to their brain.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, how can parents tell if their child might have CAS? What are the red flags to look out for?
Well, one of the most common signs is inconsistent errors in speech. So you might notice that your child says a word one way and then a few minutes later says it differently, even if they're trying to say it the same way both times.
So it's that lack of consistency that can be a clue.
Exactly. And you might also see them struggling with the rhythm and melody of speech. Their speech might sound a bit choppy or monotone.
And I imagine that can be frustrating for a child who's trying so hard to communicate.
You're right, it can be really tough. And sometimes you'll see kids visibly groping for sounds, like they're searching for the right way to position their mouth.
It sounds like early diagnosis is crucial. We don't want to just wait and see if this goes away on its own, right?
Absolutely not. Early intervention is key. The sooner we can start supporting a child with CAS, the better their chances of making significant progress.
So if a parent suspects their child might have CAS, what's the first step? Who should they contact?
A speech-language pathologist, or SLT for short, is your go-to person. But it's important to find one who specializes in CAS because it requires a specific set of skills and knowledge.
So we're not just talking about any SLT. We're looking for someone with that specialized expertise.
Right, and there are specific assessment tools that can help diagnose CAS, like the DAP and the Nuffield Dyspraxia Program Assessment.
So those are the names to remember, and we'll make sure to put links to those in our show notes as well. Now let's talk about solutions. Once a diagnosis is made, what are the next steps? What kind of treatments are available that have actually been proven to work?
There are a number of really effective interventions out there, and our sources actually highlight 5 evidence-based treatments.
Okay, that's helpful to have a starting point. Can you give us an example of one that stands out?
One that I find really effective is called dynamic temporal and tactile cueing, or DTTC for short.
BTTC, got it.
It's really hands-on and involves lots of repetition. The therapist uses a variety of cues to help the child learn the correct movements for speech. Visual cues, tactile cues, sometimes even using touch to guide the child's mouth.
It's almost like teaching them a new dance, but for their mouth.
That's a fantastic way to think about it. You're building that muscle memory for speech. Another popular approach is rapid syllable transition treatment, or REST.
Okay, rest. And what does that one focus on?
It's all about helping the child smoothly and quickly transition between syllables. It tackles that choppiness we talked about earlier.
So it's about making those transitions more fluid and effortless. Now, this is a question I think a lot of parents might be wondering about. I remember when my nephew was a toddler, he was doing all these exercises like sticking out his tongue, blowing bubbles. I always thought that was for speech development.
Yeah, those are classic oral motor exercises.
All right. Are those kinds of exercises helpful for CAS?
That's a great question and a common misconception. The short answer is no, they don't really help with CAS.
Really? So blowing bubbles is fun, but it's not going to rewire the brain for speech.
Exactly. The research is pretty clear on this. While those exercises might work on general oral motor skills, they don't target the specific coordinated movements needed for speech.
So it's important for parents to know what not to waste their time on.
Absolutely. Focus on those interventions that have been proven to work.
Okay, so we've talked about DTTC and rest. What else is crucial for parents to understand as they're on this journey?
Treatment intensity is a big one. Research suggests that more frequent therapy sessions lead to better outcomes. So ideally, we're talking about 4 times a week.
That makes sense. The more you practice, the better you get. It's the same with any skill. But I can imagine juggling that many appointments can be tough for families.
It's definitely a challenge, and it's something that therapists and families need to work together on, finding a schedule that's both effective and realistic.
It's about finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the emotional side of things. It's essential for parents to be patient and supportive because progress can be gradual.
I was actually really moved by the case studies we have. Seeing real-life examples of children with CAS improving is just so encouraging. It gives me hope for other families out there going through this.
Those stories are so powerful. They show how much progress is possible with the right support. And it also highlights how important it is to tailor treatment to each child's individual needs.
No two children are alike.
Exactly. And we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about intervention. Now, before we move on to part 2, I'm curious, what are your initial thoughts? What's standing out to you so far from everything we've discussed?
One thing that really struck me is how CAS can present so differently in each child. It's not like there's one textbook definition that fits everyone, is it?
That's so true, and it's actually one of the things that can make diagnosis a bit tricky, especially in younger kids who aren't talking much yet.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It's like you need a really skilled eye to pick up those subtle cues.
You need an SOE who knows exactly what to look for, and even then it can be challenging.
So it sounds like the assessment process itself needs to be tailored to the individual child as well.
100%. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation at all, and that goes for the intervention strategies too.
So what works for one child with CAS might not work for another, even if their symptoms seem similar on the surface.
That's exactly right. And that's why a really thorough assessment is so important. It's about getting a clear picture of that child's specific strengths and challenges.
And then creating a treatment plan that's truly individualized.
Spot on. And that brings us to another point that's really important for parents to be aware of.
Okay, I'm all ears.
CAS can sometimes co-occur with other conditions, and that can make things even more complex.
You mean like other developmental or neurological conditions?
Yep. Things like developmental dysarthria, which also affects the muscles involved in speech, but it's caused by a different underlying issue than CAS.
So both conditions can impact a child's speech, but in different ways.
Right. And distinguishing between the two can be a real challenge, but it's crucial because it informs the treatment approach.
It sounds like having a skilled differential diagnosis is key.
Absolutely. Luckily, there are some new tools and resources out there that can help therapists with that. One that I've found helpful is a tool that was published just a couple of years ago called A Tool for Differential Diagnosis of Childhood Apraxia of Speech and Dysarthria in Children.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But it sounds incredibly valuable.
It really is. It's designed to guide clinicians through that process of teasing apart the different characteristics of CAS and dysarthria.
So it helps them make a more accurate diagnosis. That's fantastic.
It is. And it's a great example of how research is constantly moving forward and providing us with better tools to help these children.
Speaking of other conditions, I know that language difficulties can also go hand in hand with CAS. Is that right?
That's a really common co-occurring issue, and it makes sense when you think about it. If a child is struggling to produce speech sounds, it can impact their ability to learn and use language effectively.
It can create a sort of domino effect.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to assess both speech and language skills in any child with CAS. We need to look at the whole picture of their communication development.
So we've got dysarthria and language difficulties. Are there any other conditions that parents should be aware of?
Yes. There are certain genetic disorders and syndromes that have been linked to CAS.
Like what, for example?
Well, our sources mention Down syndrome, galactosemia, epilepsy, even some specific genetic variations that are directly tied to CAS.
Wow, so there's a pretty wide range of possibilities.
It really highlights how complex CAS is. It's not just one thing. It can be influenced by a whole range of factors.
That makes sense. Now, I have a question that I've heard come up a lot. What about autism? Is there a connection between autism and CAS?
It's definitely a common question, and it's important to clarify this. While some children with autism do have motor speech difficulties, it's not the same thing as CAS.
So having autism doesn't automatically mean a child also has CAS.
Right. They are separate conditions, and the research actually suggests that the motor speech difficulties seen in some autistic children are distinct from the core characteristics of CAS.
So again, it comes down to a careful assessment to differentiate between those conditions.
Exactly. It's crucial not to jump to conclusions. We need a thorough evaluation by a qualified professional.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the long-term outlook for children with CAS. What can parents expect as their child gets older?
The good news is that the research is very encouraging. With consistent support, early intervention, and a lot of patience, most children with CAS can achieve significant improvements in their speech.
That's really heartening to hear. But I imagine there's a wide range of outcomes depending on the severity of the CAS and the individual child.
Of course, every child's journey is unique. Some children might make remarkable progress and have very few noticeable speech difficulties as they get older.
That's fantastic.
It is. Others might continue to have some residual speech difficulties even with years of therapy.
So there's no magic crystal ball that can tell us exactly what's going to happen.
Not yet, at least. But early intervention does make a big difference. It helps to set those kids on the right track and gives them the best chance of reaching their full potential.
So that early intervention window is really crucial.
It is. And it's also important to remember that even if a child continues to have some speech difficulties, it doesn't define them. They can still lead full and happy lives.
It's about finding ways to support their communication and help them participate fully in all aspects of life.
Exactly. And that brings up another important point that our sources address. Access to speech therapy services can be a real challenge for some families.
Oh, I can imagine that's a big issue.
It is. There are a lot of factors that can come into play, things like funding, location, and availability of qualified therapists.
So even if you know your child needs help, getting access to that help can be a whole other hurdle.
Exactly. And unfortunately, it's a problem that many families face.
So what can parents do if they're running into these barriers? Are there any resources or organizations that can help?
Absolutely. The Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists has a great list of organizations and support groups that are specifically for families of children with speech sound disorders.
That sounds like a valuable resource. I bet those organizations can provide a lot of guidance and support.
They can. They offer information about CAS, tips on advocating for services, and even just connecting with other families who are going through similar experiences.
That peer support can be so valuable.
Yeah.
It's knowing that you're not alone in this.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful message for parents to take away. You're not alone. There is help out there, and there are people who understand what you're going through. Now, as we wrap up this section on access to services, what's resonating with you? What are you finding particularly thought-provoking?
I keep thinking about how important treatment intensity seems to be. The more frequent the therapy, the better the outcomes for kids with CAS.
Yeah, that's a really key point, and it kind of makes sense when you think about how the brain learns, right? It's all about repetition and practice. The more a child practices those speech movements, the stronger those neural connections become.
It's like anything else you want to get good at. You have to put in the time and effort.
Exactly. It's like building a muscle. You wouldn't expect to see results if you only went to the gym once a month.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
But I also know that finding the time and resources for frequent therapy sessions can be a huge challenge for families.
Absolutely. It's a real juggling act and not always feasible for everyone. So it's important to be aware of some of the alternative approaches that are out there.
Okay, so what are some other options for families who might not be able to swing those 4 times a week sessions?
Well, one model that's becoming increasingly popular is the intensive summer camp format.
Ooh, summer camp for CAS. That sounds kind of fun.
Right. It's a great way to combine intensive therapy with a fun and engaging environment. Kids get to socialize, make friends, and practice their speech skills all at the same time.
I could see how that would be a lot more motivating for some kids than traditional therapy sessions.
Exactly. And it can be easier for families to schedule a block of therapy during the summer when things are a little less hectic.
That makes a lot of sense. What about families who might not have easy access to specialized clinics? Are there any options for them?
Teletherapy has really taken off in recent years.
Oh yeah, that's becoming more and more common these days. So families can connect with a therapist remotely using video conferencing.
Yep. It's a game changer for families who live far away from clinics or have transportation issues.
It's really amazing how technology is opening up access to care.
It really is. And the early research suggests that teletherapy can be effective for CAS, though we need more studies to compare it directly to in-person therapy.
It's great to know that families have more options now than ever before. Now, I want to talk about the role of parents and caregivers in all of this. What can they do to support their child's therapy journey outside of those formal sessions?
Oh, their involvement is absolutely essential. It can make a world of difference. One thing that our sources really emphasize is caregiver training, empowering parents and caregivers to become active participants in the therapy process.
So it's about extending those therapy techniques into everyday life.
Exactly. Making it a part of the child's daily routine, not just something that happens in a therapy room. And speaking of making therapy fun, have you heard about gamification?
Gamification, like using video games to help kids with CAS.
You got it. Researchers are developing some really cool interactive games that are specifically designed to target those essential speech skills.
I love that idea. Kids these days are so tech savvy, it just seems like a natural fit.
It is. And some of these games even use automatic speech recognition technology to give feedback in real time, which can be incredibly motivating for kids.
Wow, that's amazing. It sounds like there are so many innovative tools and approaches emerging in this field.
It's a really exciting time to be working with kids with CES. There's so much potential for growth and progress.
Now, I remember you mentioned earlier that it's important to measure outcomes beyond just speech accuracy. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, absolutely. You know, those traditional measures that just focus on whether a child can say a sound correctly, they don't really capture the full impact of CAS.
Right, because it's about so much more than just saying individual sounds.
Exactly. We need to look at how CAS affects a child's ability to communicate in real-life situations, how it impacts their confidence and their social interactions, their overall quality of life.
It's about the big picture.
Exactly. And our source actually points to the World Health Organization's framework, the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, or ICF for short.
Okay, the ICF.
It's a really helpful way to think about the different levels of functioning and how CAS can impact a child's life beyond just speech production.
So it's not just about the impairment itself, it's about how that impairment affects their daily life, their participation in different activities.
That's it. And this framework also highlights the importance of personal factors, like a child's motivation and self-esteem, as well as environmental factors like family support and access to services.
It really emphasizes that whole child perspective. It's not just about treating the disorder, it's about supporting the whole child.
Absolutely. And that has big implications for both research and clinical practice. It means we need to develop new outcome measures that go beyond just speech accuracy. We need to measure a child's intelligibility in everyday conversations, their ability to participate in social situations, how therapy impacts their overall well-being.
So it's about measuring what really matters to children and families.
Right. And it also means we need to be more mindful of the potential impact of therapy on those broader outcomes.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, for example, some really intensive therapy approaches, while effective in improving speech, might lead to frustration or fatigue for a child, and that could negatively affect their motivation or self-esteem.
So it's about finding that balance between pushing for progress and also protecting the child's emotional well-being.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, and it requires open communication with families, careful monitoring of the child's reactions, and always keeping the whole child in mind.
It's about empowering parents to make informed decisions about their child's therapy, considering both the potential benefits and the risks.
Absolutely. And it's about advocating for policies and funding models that ensure equitable access to high-quality services for all children with CA, regardless of where they live or their socioeconomic background.
Well, I think that's a fantastic message to end on. This has been such an insightful deep dive into the world of CAS. We've covered so much ground, from the latest research on diagnosis and intervention to the crucial roles that parents, therapists, and researchers all play in supporting these amazing kids.
It's been a real pleasure exploring this topic with you, and I hope our listeners feel more informed and empowered to navigate their own journeys with CA.
Remember, you're not alone in this. There's a wealth of information and support available, and every step forward, no matter how small, is a victory worth celebrating.
And as we continue to learn more about CAS and develop new and innovative interventions, the future for children with this condition is brighter than ever.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to keep diving deeper, connect with others, and never stop advocating for your child. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.